My name is Hanka Kent. I was born in Poland in a little town called Helm, 60 kilometers from Lublin. Helm is known for all sorts of things, among which the Shalom Aleichem stories, and the people from Helm are known as not very bright. It's not a mythical town. It really exists, and a lot of humor has been written about Helm. I came from, I guess, a lower middle class family, in the sense that my father was a shopkeeper who had a store of cigarettes, cigars, various sundries. My mother helped in the store. I vividly recall the apartment that we lived in. It was a second-story building. I would say mostly 99.9 inhabited by Jewish families and rather large families, where the average household consisted of a minimum of 6 children, mother and father, and usually, if there was a grandmother or grandfather alive, they were there as well. In our building, there lived a cobbler and a shoemaker that I vividly recall. As a matter of fact, I'm just recalling it now, only because whenever my parents were late coming back from work, I would sit and watch him make shoes. It was my second home. I also recall we had our apartment had 2 rooms, 2 bedrooms, a living room, dining room, and kitchen, all in one. So it was really 3 rooms. We did not have any water. Water was supplied to us by a man who brought water daily, I suppose. We had a milk lady who delivered the milk, fresh milk, to us on a daily basis. We had no refrigeration of any sort, and we had an outhouse which was downstairs, summer and winter. Our refrigeration in the wintertime consisted of putting the food in between the windows and outside in the snow. And we had every other day, if not every day, a gentleman, he was called a balagula, knocked on the door and delivered the mail from my grandfather's town to my mother, who, while he was waiting, quickly wrote a letter in Yiddish and gave it to him so that he could deliver it back. We had no telephone, we had no radio. We had, as I was growing up, we had no electricity, though I remember there was electricity in town. Yet, without any of those physical comforts, I cannot think of a happier childhood in anyone's life than mine was. First of all, because I knew I was the most important thing always in my parents' lives and in my grandparents' lives in my immediate family. Second of all, because I had places to roam, felt very unrestricted in what I could do, and spent wonderful family gatherings with friends, Saturday picnics in the woods, which I loved every Saturday, and always having an extended family and my neighbors. My mother was like the social worker of the building. My childhood memories of smells evoke always a pot of soup in the kitchen, even though our kitchen was, you had to chop wood and coal to burn it every day. On top of the iron stove, there was always a pot boiling, and whoever came to that house did not have to ask permission, just took a plate and filled the soup and bread, etc. The Shabbat preparations are vividly also in my mind of that. There was always an extra person at our table because we were a small family and I was an only child. And the charity to the poor was very much stressed in our household. It was my duty, since I was a little girl, to, number one, take the chicken on Friday to the man who, the shochet, who killed it. Then I had to take it to a place. It was my job to flick the feathers to a special place. I was surrounded by feathers. And then it was my job to...
We're having a problem with the microphone. We're going to have to stop. pronounce your name Hanka.
Hanka.
Right? Hanka.
Hanka. Yeah, that's...
Okay, stand by.
Okay, you'd also tell what your dad's name is, your mother's name.
Yes.
Now, as you weave it,
Yes.
Okay. Well, you were telling us about how Shabbat was celebrated in your home.
Yes, Shabbat was a very special evening, not just in my home, but in the entire shtetl of Helm. And there are several things that stand out in my mind. First of all, my father, whose name was Gershon Saikevich, and my mother's name, her name was Minche. They actually called her Nunche. Both of them equally participated in the preparation of Shabbat. I remember my mother, I forgot a very important thing about Shabbat was we did not have an oven, but the wealthiest neighbor in our apartment building had a baker's oven in her apartment building. So every Thursday night of my life, all the women would go downstairs, and there was a community bake, and all the children from that apartment building would be gathered there. The bread was baked for the entire week, all the cookies, and the challah for Shabbat. And while the women were baking, the men were sitting and just talking politics or joking or whatever. But it clearly was the highlight of the week. Beginning, Shabbat started already Thursday night when the entire apartment building would get together downstairs. You could smell the smells from the cinnamon cookies to the rolls, I thought, for miles. And then, of course, my mother would clean the kitchen. We used to say the floor, since it was wooden, was as yellow as a yolk of an egg. And the entire apartment took on a complete transformation. And especially in my eyes, everything just sparkled. The crystal, even though it could have been glass for all I know, was like diamond cut. It was just brilliantly clear, and the floor was sparkling, and a white tablecloth, and the challah was baked. And my job was to go to the shochet with the chicken that my mother bought at the peasant market, fresh. And the shochet became my friend, because I came every single, I forgot whether it was Thursday or Friday with it. And then, of course, I took it to a place where we would pluck it. Not just I, but everyone else in town. It seems like it was plucking their chicken. And then after it was plucked, I brought it home. And another job I had was that I had to take our chulent to the bakery where it was baked, and then pick it up on Saturday afternoon for our meal. The chulent my mother prepared every Friday of her life, and she would make the pot. She would seal it with dough so that it wouldn't escape, and then she would put newspaper, and tie it with a string. And when I picked it up, all the paper was scorched and dark brown, and of course it steamed, and I would bring it home piping hot in the clay pot. But I would watch my mother cook every single Friday for Shabbat. And actually, by the time I was 10, I could close my eyes, and I knew how to make everything from scratch, just by observation, since everything was done by hand. And I remember and of course, we as children, even though my household, we did not go to shul on Friday night. My father did not take me, only occasionally. All of our hair was dipped. We did not have a bathroom, so this was our community Shabbat. We bathed for Shabbat. Water was brought in from the outside and in one tub, and then all of our hair was with naphtha, which was a naphthalene, and so to prevent lice from forming in our hair. And we would have a special dress, and our shoes were shined, so that the feeling of Shabbat, I mean, you just walked on the street, and Shabbat was smelling from all over. It was a very warm, loving time of day. We spent all day long just walking in the park, going for picnics, and then at night we would have a Havdalah service with everyone in the apartment building, and we would light the first lamp, because we didn't have any electricity, warm at the stove, and just beautiful memories of Shabbat. And our dilemma was, I had lots of friends. Helm did not have any public transportation, so it was a city where you walked a lot. And it seems like, and we didn't have any telephones, and we had lots of communication with other people. My mother was blessed, my parents were blessed with a lot of friends, And I, being an only child, they took me everywhere with them. So I knew, so we would always be going to wish somebody a happy Shabbat or a happy holiday, or people would come to our apartment. And on Saturdays, we would all get together with all the children. It was a Saturday ritual, and go into the woods, which must have been on the outskirts, since we had to walk, and spend the day with the children playing.
For you?
Well, it was very interesting, because I remember I went every single summer of my life, when school was out, I went to a private school called Tarbut. It was a school which had the same curriculum as the schools that in Israel. The Hebrew that I learned in that school was Sfardit. It was not Ashkenazi, since my parents, even though I thought they were religious, were very modern in their thinking. And when school was over, I would go every single summer and spend the entire summer with my grandparents. My grandfather, because my grandmother was dead. I never knew her. She died in childbirth. And I remember in my grandfather's little town, Rehovets, which was a village, and everybody knew each other. Again, no radios. Everything took place on the square, where you went to get water. All the gossip and all the politics. There were some public radios that people, and I vividly remember people talking about the war, and it didn't register. And I came home early because it started in September before school, because there was already apprehension.
How old were you then?
I was I guess I was 9. A little over, yeah. Because I was born in March 1st, 1930, and I'm talking about September of 1939. And I remember, for some reason or another, our waterman, our Wasserträger, the man who would come to the house, and we paid him by the week, I guess, I don't know what arrangements, and bring us water, could not come to deliver water. So I was sent to the pump to get a pail of water. And I went downstairs, and as I stood, just all of a sudden, we heard bombs. And planes would just come low, and within seconds, it seemed like the whole town was going to go up in flames. As a matter of fact, it's an incident that I didn't recall until just now. It was when the war started, my parents and a lot of other people escaped that little town because they didn't, and we went into a village. We took whatever few possessions we could, and we were in the village to wait out what we thought was the war. And we must have stayed in the village for a few days or a few weeks. I cannot recall the extension of time. But when we came back, Poland was already decimated, and soon after, the Russians walked into our city of Helm.
Was there a lot of destruction?
Tremendous. Not in Helm so much, but only in the sense that every backyard was taken over by Polish soldiers, mess kitchens. The army was all over the city in our little town, the Polish army. And soon afterwards, there was no Polish army, and the Russian army came in. And the first thing and I vividly remember the Russian army because, first of all, I remember as a child listening to stories that they went into the stores and they took nightgowns thinking they were evening dresses. I remember listening to the grown-ups talking. And then the Russians set up and the Russian soldiers had these long army kaftans, I guess, and the hems were not hemmed. And I remember looking at them and seeing strands of string, what do you call it? I guess string, not string, but the wool that the fabric is woven with, hanging down, and it struck me so funny. And they set up, the town was just infiltrated with Russian soldiers, and in the middle of the square, we had a square in Helm, they made a tomb to the unknown soldier. And it was bedecked with flowers, and it had all sorts of ornaments around it, and the Russian flag. And when I was growing up, a lot of my friends' parents, a lot of my friends' fathers were always in jail. And I remember they told me that the reason they were in jail was because their fathers were communists. Well, when the Russians came in, the first thing they did is they opened the jail, and all the Jews that were in jail were let out, and they became the leaders of Helm, so to speak. Tanks marched in the entire city, a lot of handling, a lot of street business was conducted. This I remember. People were selling things, they were selling watches, and they were doing all sorts of business with the Russian soldiers. And actually, we never were hungry during that time, and it was a very peaceful time for us under the Russian occupancy. And just out of the blues, as quickly as they came, one day, we didn't know what was going on behind the scenes. They packed everything, and they withdrew from Helm.
What was that like for you as a little girl?
I was very happy during that time because the bombing had stopped, and the town seemed to have. We were back in our own household, which I loved, and life, even though it was not the same as it was before the war, it was very pleasant for us, and we had plenty of food, and we had our own apartment, and we were not restricted into any activities. So it was a joyful time for me.
Why did the Russians leave? Do you know?
I think what happened, I didn't know it at the time because everything was hush-hush, but now with history, they made a pact with Germany that they were going to withdraw from that part of Poland. This was the agreement, but they were in our town for several months.
Did you have a chance, did your family have a chance to leave with them?
It was very interesting. As Russia was pulling out, hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of people from that part of Poland went to Russia with the Russians. The Russian soldiers stopped by every Jewish household and asked us to leave. And they came to our household, and my mother, vividly, I remember my parents talking about it, that they had an opportunity to leave, and not only leave, but the Russian people, the soldiers told them that they could take everything with them, including the sewing machine, which was like saying you could take your Cadillac. I mean, this was the height of what we had. And my parents decided, no, they will not go with the Russians, because when the war was over, there was never a question in my parents' mind. It wasn't as if the war was over. I mean, there was never a doubt that they were going to survive the war. It was because they said Russia was known as the closed casket, and when the war was over, they will not have a chance to go to Israel, to Palestine. They knew for sure that they will not have a chance to go to Palestine, whereas when the war was over, from Poland, there was no question in their mind that they were going to emigrate
to
Palestine. They were very Zionistically inclined. As a matter of fact, my first recall of my life, my first visual recall, were 3 pictures in my mother's house and my house. One was Jabotinsky, one was Herzl, and one was Chaim Nachman Bialik. Those are my 3, and our household revolved around songs of Trumpeldor, which my mother sang every single day of her life, Jabotinsky, and those were her 2 heroes. That she constantly went around collecting money for Palestine, and her dream in life, both my parents' dream, was to go to Palestine, above and beyond anything else.
What happened after the Russians left?
When the Russians left, the town was left without anyone. In other words, the Poles decided, and we went into hiding because the Poles started being a pogrom started right away. The Poles took out the fact that the Jews were communists that were let out from jail. The Poles decided to take revenge on the Jews that were left in Helm. It was really for the wrong people, because the Jews that were communists left with the Russians, so they took it out, and we went into hiding. For 2 days we heard nothing but shots all night long.
Where did you hide?
We hid behind, it's very interesting, in our apartment where the bakery was, there was one like a closet apart, which had a big, what do you call it, where you put your clothes in. There was an armoire, and this armoire was put. Now, I don't remember I remember certain things, but I have a very hard time. In other words, I remember an incident where my mother fell on the floor and pleaded for my father's life from a Pole that stood with a gun. But I don't remember whether it was the first night or whether it was. All I remember is that when we heard shots and we heard a tremendous amount of noise, and there was a tremendous amount of fear of the people that were hiding in this walk-in closet. It was like one room, a little room, like a walk-in closet. And I remember my mother and father begging God to please send the Germans in, because they knew they could not go through another night, because they were coming closer and closer. And when we got out from this hiding place on the third day, we saw bodies, dead bodies, sprawled all over on the street in our apartment building. All the stores, the windows were knocked out, all the merchandise, and it was just like you see a battle, except there were civilians. I don't know what I cried. I don't remember what I cried. I know that I was scared to death. I was horrified that I would lose my parents. I was very afraid, and I remember having this tremendous feeling that I saw my mother pleading for my father's life, and I don't remember in what context, whether somebody had a gun to my father. But I remember my parents being overjoyed when the first tanks of the Germans came in. We stood in that square, and I remember it was fall or something like that. It was raining, and I don't remember what time of the year it was, and just thanking God, thank God that God had enough mercy to send somebody finally in to occupy the city, because they were convinced that one more day there wouldn't have been one Jew left in Helm due to the Polish. See, anti-Semitism was very strong in the small towns, and the first words that I recall as a child were "Jew, go to Palestine." As a matter of fact, the reason my parents sent me to a private school was because I could not go to a public school. There were stonings and beatings every single day. And even in the private school, my father had to take me every morning and pick me up after school every night. This was just something that I lived with all my life as a second-class citizen. I just never knew that there was a part of the world where things are different. And we would come to school, and half of the time the windows were out, the desks were broken. And this was just something that I took for granted, that it's my lot in life as a Jew.
So as the Germans came in, it was really a hopeful...
Very hopeful, very hopeful. Although we had heard how awful it was in Germany through the newspapers. As a matter of fact, my parents had some relatives in the town that my grandfather was from that left Poland to escape this statal existence. They went to the big city of Berlin, and were very successful there. And of course, when Hitler came, they came back to Poland. I remember them talking about that. Nevertheless, they said the Germans are very civilized, and order will be restored. And after order will be restored, whatever they'll do, it's a war. They will, but nothing. They never believed a word that they read in the newspapers.
What happened to your family when the Germans
Well, when the Germans came, actually it was a very gradual, it started off by the first couple of days, really nothing very much, and then slowly, right away, they restricted us to a certain part of the city, like a ghetto. And after they restricted us to a certain part of the city, we could only live in that part of the city. We had restrictions, like we had curfew hours, very strong curfew hours, like 7 o'clock at night, and we couldn't be out after that. And then we had to wear the yellow star. And then, of course, one of the things is that my father had to close his store, so we had no means of livelihood, which is something as a child, I didn't really know too much about, and I guess a lot of it was going kind of like a little black market. In other words, you took some cigarettes here, and you got some potatoes, or you took some jewelry, whatever it was, and you got some bread, or, things like that. And that's how we existed, without any work, without any livelihood, living in our part of the city. My father left one day in the morning, not at a regular time, because even the store, it wasn't like an 8 o'clock shop, it was morning. He left for the street, and he never came home. And apparently what it was, they called it, I think it was called later on the Black Friday or Black Thursday. What they did is they rounded up the men. That's how it started, and my father was among the first to be rounded up. And supposedly they were sent to a working camp. And we never saw my father again.
When did you realize that he wasn't going to come back?
We realized it most probably after a couple of days, 2 or 3 days, because then rumor had it because it wasn't just us. We realized that all of a sudden, as we were in closer communication with others, and by that time the Germans started coming to, we were horrified that they would knock on the door. They started pulling beards out from men on the street. They started kicking and shooting on the spot. And all of a sudden we became horrified for our life from minute to minute.
And did you talk with your mother during that time?
It was very interesting. Actually, my father was still alive. Rumors, my parents must have heard rumors that wagons were going through and that children were separated from their parents. And my parents took me and they said, my parents said to me, they said, you know, we love you very much. And there might be a time when we will have to be separated. We want you to know that no matter what happens, you are in charge of your sister. And it's your responsibility to take care of her to the best of your ability until we are reunited again. So I saw the first change I saw really was when my father was taken away from us, because we were cut off from communication with my grandfather, even though it was only 15 kilometers. My mother was very close. She was the only child. She was the oldest of her 7 sisters and brother. And actually, my aunt would have had a chance to come to the United States, but there was a feeling among among the Jewish families that one would not leave without the other one. The oldest had to get married, etc., down the line. My mother, because her mother died in childbirth, she sort of assumed the role as the older sister. She was the mother to her, so that she lost that contact and she lost my father. So it was, we definitely began to feel at this point our life changed.
What did you and your mother do after you realized that your father was gone?
Well, soon afterwards, I guess, I don't recall just what rumor it was, but they started taking women and children too. So that whoever was left in the apartment that we lived in, plus I guess there must have been other people too from other apartments, we went into hiding. And we went into a cellar. And I don't know how many people. There could have been 20, there could have been 25, there could have been 30, I cannot recall, but I know it was a goodly number of people. And we had provisions when we started off, and we were there for a long, long time, in total darkness. But when we went in there, the weather was balmy and it was still sunny. So it had to be, I don't know, most probably was like fall, at the beginning of fall. And we stayed there until there were children there too, including my little sister, and we stayed there until we ran out of supplies. And I remember that we were drinking urine just for fluids. And when things got very bad and the children started crying desperately and they were dehydrated, and I guess it must be awful to watch for a mother to watch her child dying. And we heard the SS. We started hearing voices already all around us. As they were looking, it was down to rubble already, Helm. In other words, it got to a point where the SS was looking already from door to door, when the door to door looking, and the cellar to cellar, when nothing was left unturned. They opened part of the cellar. It seemed very quiet, and they saw snow on the ground, and so my mother went outside to get some snow to bring back to the cellar for my little sister, maybe for me too, I don't know. And we heard shots, and so I lost my mother. And soon after, the SS found us in that cellar, and they marched all of us out, and they asked all of us to undress. And I don't know what happened. I know that I heard shouts and shooting, and I started running with my little sister. And I hid. I ran away from that. I don't know whether it was a grave, I don't know whether it was a ditch that they were shooting, whether they made us line up in a ditch. But before I got completely, all I know is that my sister and I escaped miraculously. And we ended up in a synagogue. And we spent the whole night there. And the next day, and towards evening, no, I'm sorry, we ran in the morning there, it was in the morning, and we spent the morning hiding in the synagogue, and towards evening, when it got pitch dark, I took my little sister and partially walked and partially carried her, and blindly walked to my grandfather's town, which was 15 kilometers. In the middle of the night, hiding under bridges, I knew the way with my eyes closed, thinking that my grandfather and my aunts and uncle and my cousins were there. And when I got there, there was no one left for my family. They were on the transport. There was not one soul left for my entire family there, except people that knew me as a child and knew my family. And the city, they had a ghetto. It was a working ghetto, and there was a a factory that made sugar from sugar beets, and everybody was registered legally and went to work in that factory, except people who were elderly and they couldn't work. They had to be registered, and no one was allowed to enter that ghetto. In other words, never dishes. So I ended up living with a family illegally, and they gave me a cellar where I slept at night. Every single night my little sister and I went down to the cellar to sleep, and during the day, when everybody went to work, I cleaned and I scrubbed the floor and I washed and ironed for food. And they supported me. This one gave me a bowl of soup, this one gave me a piece of bread for doing whatever chores. I was like a cleaning woman or maid, and there was a kitchen, and it was one room really, and there was a table, and there was a curtain around the table, and my little sister was during the day underneath that table, so she wouldn't be seen. That's how at night we were in the cellar. And in that building, in those circumstances, I lived for quite a while. And one of the girls that was a couple of years older than I am and was my friend, whose family I knew before the war, she was a personal maid to one of the, she was very well developed, and she was a beautiful girl. Her name was Esther, and she became a personal maid to one of the assessmen in this working camp, the sugar beet factory. And she would get a lot of extra rations, etc., and all sorts of extra privileges. And I don't know whether she was involved with this assessment or whether it was just that he liked her as a person. But all I know is that somehow it came out, she told him that my situation, that I am there illegally, that I'm living in their quarters, and I have a little sister. And so he came and visited and became like my friend. In other words, he knew already, and she reassured me that I will not be in danger. He was in charge, that he knows of my existence and not to be worried. And one day when everybody was working, everybody was at the sugar factory, and I was left in this little room with my little sister behind, underneath. My sister was already, incidentally, I have to tell you that these people in San Diego who know me and know this whole story, they were from this little town. They said, they reminded me how sick my little sister was.
What was her name?
Feigele. Phyllis in English.
Uh-huh.
And she was 18 months old,
Uh-huh.
and she was very sick, and we had no medication, and she cried a lot. And one day, this assessment that already befriended me, and I had a feeling he was my friend, came with somebody else who was like the village doctor, not the doctor, an MD, but he was what they call a Fleischer. He was a, what do you call
Barber?
it? A barber. And they had a license to give leeches and give medication. The assessment and the barber came, and they asked me to go and fetch them some water. And I never questioned this, because this was, I just whatever somebody asked me to do. I fetched water for people in the community anyway. I went, he said he needed some fresh water, and I went with my bucket to fetch some water. And when I came back, my little sister was dead. He had given her a shot. And she died. And he said to me later, he said, I know it's very difficult, for you to see it, what I'm going to tell you, he said. He said, but tomorrow, the entire camp is going to Majdanek, is going to a concentration camp. And this is your only chance to survive. I did you a favor.
What were your feelings then when he told you that?
I think if I could have killed, I just couldn't. I had such a tremendous strong of responsibility from my parents saying this and taking care of my little sister all these months, especially being an only child all these years.
Did you feel you had betrayed her?
Yes, very much so. I felt I didn't come through for my parents, completely betrayed her. As a matter of fact, it took me years after the war that I couldn't even look at the child. I felt so guilty. And my girlfriend in California, who is one of the leading psychoanalysts in the city, as a matter of fact, she's affiliated on a partial basis with UCLA. When I met her, it's a friendship of 20 years, when I met her and I told her my story, she said, you must feel guilty like hell. And I said, don't be ridiculous. 30 years later, I had nothing to do with it. And she said, like hell you didn't. You just wait and start thinking about it. And I realized how guilty I feel about a million other things, which most probably still relate to this day to the fact that. But the truth of the matter is that I know the story now because they are people, the people that I lived with are all alive, and they are in Detroit. So I have, as a matter of fact, I just saw them in Washington when I went to the Holocaust gathering, and they recalled, a lot of the things. And this girl, this assessment's friend, she's the only one that did not go to Majdanek. She stayed with him and was the only one of this household who did not survive. Because she was going to escape. He made special provisions for her from that family. But the brother, there was the man who lived in that house, I was not registered. And somehow the rumor got out that there was one person illegal. I hid. He told me the next day when the people are counted, you don't come out. Just try to join the group on the way to the wagons, but don't come out during the counting. So even though I didn't want to do what he told me to, feeling that he had betrayed me, somehow, I don't know, instinctively I obeyed him. And I hid in the cellar where I slept. I didn't do anything. But this man was looking, they had to account for me. The man was in charge of counting, a Jewish man. And he knew, he said later on, had he known where I was hiding, he would have produced me. Because they said if they don't produce the extra person, they were going to kill him. But the only place he didn't look was the cellar there, because it just seemed too easy and too natural that somebody would do something so stupid and hide in a place where everybody knows where she's at. So this is the only place he didn't look. Anyway, they waited and waited, and he didn't produce me, and they finally gave up after many hours. They stood and stood and stood. No one was shot. I was able to see out from the cellar, because it was all. And when I saw that hundreds of people started shoveling, I got out and somehow managed to join the group without being counted. And we were sent to Majdanek. It was my first concentration camp. And they did separate the women from the children. And there wasn't one doubt in my mind that if my little sister would have been with me in there was just no way on earth that I would have gone without her. First of all, if they would have just looked at the two of us, they would have sent us for the children, because I was, 10 years old, a little over 10, but I was very tall for my age. I did not grow 1 inch since 1940, I don't think so. I was known in the village in Helm as the tallest child. They called me the noodle. I was all legs, and I was very strong, and extremely strong, physically. And so when they put left, right, they put me with the workers. And so I ended up at Majdanek, and I stayed at Majdanek. And somehow always felt very, very lonely, because I think I was one of the very few people in concentration camp. I didn't have any friends with me. I didn't have a sister with me. There were mothers and daughters. There were a lot of, most families in Poland were large families. They had sisters, they had cousins. I had no one in concentration camp, never had anyone from my family. I was really utterly alone. And we worked at menial jobs. We worked on boulders, carried boulders from one side of the camp to the other one, day in and day out. I don't remember ever doing anything in Majdanek that was constructive work, but I do remember it was the first camp where not men SS but women SS were in charge of us. And I remember they guarded us with German Shepherd dogs, and every time you did the smallest infraction of wrong or whatever it was in their eyes that they felt you didn't obey, then the dogs were let loose on you. And that was a horrifying experience for me. Till this day I cannot go close. If I see a German Shepherd, I go crazy and walk on the other side of the street. I will not come into somebody's house when there is a German Shepherd.
Were they ever released on you?
I beg your pardon?
Were they ever released on you?
No, never on me. But I was horrified when I saw them released on other women. And the Majdanek experience, it was actually the first. It was the first official concentration camp. By that I mean, our clothes was taken away from us, our heads were shaven. We had to be counted for hours and hours and hours, standing on camp, getting up at 4 in the morning. And we were in Majdanek for what seemed an eternity at the time. But from Majdanek, we were sent out to another camp. Everything after Majdanek had to be good, by comparison.
Did you have anybody at all, Hanka, at Majdanek that sort of took care of you?
No.
Nobody.
I was totally on my own in Majdanek. It was a very dark period in my life. I had just lost my little sister. I lost my parents. And actually at Majdanek there were still a lot of people who had each other, because it was the beginning of concentration camp. But there were still many families were still together. I mean, not mother and father, not families as we know them, but members of the families were together. I thought, I don't really, in retrospect, I don't know how I survived there. I was like a robot who just did what she had to do without a thought, just without thinking at all. I was devoid of all thought, was probably of all feelings, except for one thing. Coming from Helm, I was brought up that everything in life is decided. Helm was a very superstitious town. And for every little thing in life, we went to the rabbi, and it was and we really believed in a world hereafter, and we believed that everything is decided, that your life is completely, that somebody upstairs decides what life is going to be for you, and it's all faith. And so this is what kept me going in Majdanek. That it's the will of God, that I have no say-so whatsoever, that God is deciding. I remember feeling very strongly about the will of God.
Did you get angry
predestination.
At God?
I beg your pardon?
Did you get angry at God for willing this on you?
No, not at that time. I got angry as later on. Not that it was crazy. It was. I don't think so. I comprehended what was happening to me. I began to feel that that it was the will of God that what happened to my sister-in-law, so that I, for some reason or another, am saved and spared, so that I can survive. And of course, at that time, even though I knew that my mother was dead, I mean, I didn't see her body officially, but I heard the shots and we saw bodies laying in the snow. I somehow had this imagination that my father and mother survived. I mean, that's another thing that kept going through my head, that when all of this is over, that I'll be reunited with my parents. And I remember thinking hours about, that prospect of my life, and having other members like my aunts, etc., who are somewhere, I didn't know where, that have managed and are in other parts. And then from Majdanek we went to a place called Skarżysko Kamienne, which was a factory, a big ammunition factory in Poland, and it was divided into 3 segments. It was called Werk each, and one was with Werk A, Werk B, and Werk C, and I was fortunate to have been chosen for Werk A, because the people in Werk C were working with various gases and various chemicals, and they were turned into an orange color, reddish like a carrot. I remember seeing them, it absorbed into their skins, and they eventually died. And I was put, again, I had no one. I was totally underdeveloped. I had never menstruated. I was flat as a chest. I had no idea. I knew nothing about life. And I literally survived in Skarżysko on my rations, which was a piece of bread and 2 soups a day. We worked in 2 shifts, 12-hour shifts. And I was working at a Schuhabteilung. I was working at something which was made for the submarines. I started off with a little disc of steel, and I put it through a machine, and my job was to cut this piece of steel. And all day long, and we had a quota, and every day or every week they told us about a different, we had to enlarge our quota, we had to keep up what was coming from the other machine. And my biggest problem there was that pieces of steel would fall all over my legs and arms, and they would burn my skin, and so I would have I would get, burns and scars, and because we didn't have proper nutrition, we didn't have any sun, they wouldn't heal. And I was horrified, because every day or every couple of days they inspected us, and those people who had big lacerations were sent to crematorium right away. And then the only fear in Skarżysko was also the lines, left, right, so you never knew from day to day. You didn't know whether the left one was going to gas chambers and the right one, so your life sort of was hanging in this balance. And we were in Skarżysko, but Skarżysko Kamienne was not like Majdanek. It was much better. Our barracks were more, I guess we were conditioned to a certain point, and Poles were in charge of us, and it wasn't like an aimless type of working with with stones from morning to night, the days passed by quicker, and a lot of the women, they were able to have communication with the men's camp. It was co-ed, even though not in the barracks, but there was a men's division in camp as well as a women's. So there were a lot of exchanges in communication.
How about with you? Did you?
None.
Nothing.
None, absolutely nothing. A lot of the women did have boyfriends, and these men, and they were able to do something in the black market to get an extra ration of bread. I remember people were smoking cigarettes in the barracks. They would give up their bread, and they were able to buy cigarettes for it. So supplies, somehow, I had none. I literally lived on whatever was given to me. And from Skarżysko, I was taken to Częstochow, which was another factory, a ammunition factory, and I was working on little shells for hand grenades, these types of shells. And it was also a working camp. And in that camp, I finally befriended 2 sisters. One's name was Sala, and the other one was Frida. There were 2 sisters from Warsaw. One had was engaged before the war, and she was separated from fiancé and didn't know where he was. And the other one was married before the war, and of course she had no idea what happened to her husband. And we shared, I forgot whether I was upstairs and they were downstairs, but they became like my adopted family. I was very young, I was the youngest one wherever I was, and they became like my older sisters, so to speak, and they sort of watched over me, so that was a happy time. And from Skarżysko, from Częstochow, we went to Bergen-Belsen, and that was a nightmare of an experience. It was in Bergen-Belsen where I literally saw people eating, I saw human beings eating flesh with my own eyes, human flesh. In Bergen-Belsen I experienced the worst hunger. That's all it was like my mind became deranged. 24 hours a day, that's all I thought about, was food, nothing else. I vividly remember in Bergen-Belsen standing for Abfell when we were counted 4 hours or whatever it was without any clothes, I mean paper clothes and paper shoes in the wintertime, frostbitten, while we were counting, thinking only one thing: if I could only have a piece of bread and a hot potato, then I would be willing to die. I mean, this was my only wish in life. I didn't wish to be reunited with my parents. I didn't think about my little sister. All I thought about is to have a full stomach and then peacefully die. And every single day while I was in Bergen-Belsen, for the 4 hours I stood, that's all my mind would focus on, was how a hot potato looks, what it smelled like, what it felt like when it was hot. And I vividly recalled our kitchen. I remember like hallucinating and sitting down for a meal. And Bergen-Belsen was very bad, because when we were taken into Bergen-Belsen, I saw my first crematorium with my own eyes. We were ushered into a place which had the shower overheads, which I didn't know was gas. The group that I went in with was spared that experience, but we never knew from then, as the rumors started that these were gas chambers, we never knew when we were ushered into a building whether water would come out or gas would come out. And that was a horrible way to live, and we really didn't know from day to day. In other words, we never knew in the morning whether we would be there at night, because as soon as you got sick, that was the end of you. Every day there were less people in our barracks, people that we would line up with in the morning. We did not return that night, because as we went through lines and we were inspected at random, if you had the smallest scar, if they didn't like the way you looked, if you were sick, that was the end of you. So it was a...
Did you talk with the other roommates?
Yes, we talked. I did not talk as much as others. There was something about me, I don't know, I was very withdrawn, I was very shy. I had nothing much to contribute as far as an experience of my shtetl, because everyone seemed to have come from large cities. And they had adolescence behind them. Their memories were vivid. They had a longer life that they brought into concentration camp. I had none of this. And I felt very much inadequate. I didn't have the feeling of self-worth, because I did come from this little village which somehow was a shameful place to come from, only because everyone came from the big city of Warsaw or Lodz, and they were much more sophisticated than I, and they seemed to know about life much more so than I, and seemed much worldlier than I.
Was Sala and Frida there with you?
Sala and Frida were with me, but what happened was, after Bergen-Belsen, we ended up, we were evacuated from there, and we were put into wagons, cattle wagons, and the wagons were closed on the outside. Now in those wagons, in this wagon I was not with Sala and Frida, but in Bergen-Belsen I was. We ended up going to the same camp, but we were not placed in the same wagon. When we got, all of a sudden, as we had no idea where we were going, all of a sudden we stopped. We found out later on it was at a city called Würzburg. It was in Germany, and we were at the front lines. The railroad track was bombed, and we couldn't move ahead. And we must have stayed there for 3 or 4 days, with bombing from morning to night. The SS, we used to have an SS that would look in and would feed us. They stopped coming. We had these little windows from the wagons that we would look through. All we saw was flames. We had bombs and we saw flames. It was like in the middle of an inferno. And because they stopped feeding us, people would lick the moisture wherever they could, and we had no restrooms. And the heat was unbearable. People started dying in the wagons, and after what seemed an eternity, after a few days, everything stopped, and I guess they repaired the railroad tracks, and they opened the wagons and they would empty the dead bodies. and those of us that were alive, and I was still among the living, continued. And from there we came to a camp which was absolutely brand new. I mean, you looked at that camp and you knew that no one had ever, I cannot tell you the name because I forgot, but no one had ever lived in it. I mean, it was spotless, brand new wood, brand new beds, and that's where Salah and Frida, my two friends that I befriended from Częstochowa, we ended up being in the same room in the same bunk.
Did you think at that point that you were going to survive?
No, never thought we were going to survive. The whole exercise seemed absolutely futile because we were told constantly that if the war was going to be over at 12, that the Germans, that they have an order to kill us at 5 minutes to 12. But there was somehow some sort of a feeling that only a miracle, but we didn't even think about that. We were talking about one day at a time. We really lived, we just wanted to survive one extra day. But I think at this point in our, I don't think so I could think anymore. It was beyond thinking. I think it was like an animal, when you Shabbat it goes. I don't think so there were any human qualities left in me. I'm talking personally. I just was a robot that somehow by the will of God was able. But yet there must have been something else in me because there must have been a strong will to survive, which I didn't realize at the time. We got to this camp after these few days on the front line, and then we realized, we had a feeling that perhaps this was a front line where American soldiers were involved. I guess there were people in camp that must have had certain information, because we got to this spotlessly clean camp where we had a feeling there was no one else before us. It didn't look like anyone had ever been before. And it was in that camp that Salah and Frida were with me, these two sisters, and we were sharing bunks. I was in the lower and they were in the upper, or vice versa, but we were in the same room. And Frida got very sick, and she was scared to death to tell someone that she was sick, because all of us were horrified that if we tell them we are sick, that they would take us to the special, compound, which was for sick people, and from there no one ever came back from the crematorium. We did not know whether this was a camp which had ovens, which had crematorium, or whether it wasn't, but we knew that either way, being sick, you held out as long as you could. And they chose work for various details, and for some reason or another they chose me to go into the kitchen during that period of time while Frida was sick. And we were told that we are going to be working in the kitchen and that we are going to be checked and body searched to be sure that none of us bring anything out of that kitchen as far as food is concerned, because they said they would shoot us if they find anything on our body. So I went into the kitchen and I was working with boiled potatoes. And somehow this vision that I'm going to have 2 boiled potatoes was stronger than my life. And we wore these paper, the clothes which had the stripes, perhaps you saw it in the movie, and we had a string around us, so it was like a very blousy, and of course we were bones anyway. And I took 2 potatoes and I hid them on me. And obviously I was willing to pay for my life for them. And somehow they didn't search us at all at the end, and we were allowed to come back, and I had these 2 potatoes on me. And when I came back that night, and I saw Frida being as sick as she was, and her sister felt that if she only had some nutrition, that she might be nursed back, I took those 2 potatoes and I gave them to Frida, for Frida's consumption. And when Frida got well, she, for some reason or another, attributed the fact that she was better only because I had given her those 2 potatoes. Now, I have to tell you that those 2 potatoes represented, I mean, there isn't enough state jewelry that I could have now if I were to give every possession I have, it would not mean as much as giving those 2 potatoes away at that time. And so as the time went on, Frida's sister and Frida were convinced that she owes her life to those 2 potatoes, because she felt that she was already on the verge of dying. Because when we got to this camp, we didn't have regular kitchens with nutrition like we did in concentration camp. Nothing was organized. No sooner, we must have not been there more than a week. We didn't even have to start on a working detail. Nobody worked, because there was no work for us. They packed us in the middle of the night and sent us to another camp.
Was there ever a question in your mind that you were going to give her the potatoes when you got back there and saw that she was sick? Did you ever say, "Oh, maybe I just want it for myself"?
I was in conflict. I was in conflict completely. It was somehow, I think it was the upbringing that I had at home, again, that this was meant to be, that my upbringing at home was that you've got to be a good human being. It was almost like a fanatical type of goodness when you see someone suffering. It came all my life when I was a little girl. It was stressed to me. I was in charge. I started to tell you this, and it comes back to me. The third thing I forgot to tell you about Shabbat is that even though we were not wealthy at all, we were low middle class, my mother and father always stressed about the people who were not as well off as we, and it was my job to give to the poor every Friday. My mother would load me with a challah, whatever else she had, a little bag of food that I put at a certain place where we could never see who came to pick it up, because it was stressed that you give charity so that the person who receives it does not know. So I never knew who the poor person, but we had a place that somebody came and got it, and it was my job. And it was the same type of feeling that she was sick and I wasn't. And it was like, I don't know what made me do it. I didn't think that I was going to do it until I saw her. I mean, I didn't take the potatoes with that in mind at all. I took them really for myself, but couldn't eat them when I saw that she was sick. And at least consciously, I don't think so that I, took him with that in mind. I just took the 2 potatoes. And anyway, Sala, her sister, never forgot this, never, that I gave those 2 potatoes. That I took those 2 potatoes, because she knew the sacrifice that it meant for anyone to come back. And after the war, from there we were sent to various camps. But we never stayed long. As soon as we got to a camp, we would just get out of the wagons, we would get settled, and they would count us and put us into the barracks, and like 2 days later, we were whisked again. And then rumors started that the Americans and the Russians were on the front line, and we are fighting for time. And a tremendous surge of hope was instilled in us that we might make it, that the war might be over, that we are coming to the end of the war. And we went through many camps like this, maybe 4 or 5, where we would get there and we would unload, and a day or 2 later take off elsewhere. And until we came to a camp called Turkheim, which was in Bavaria. And Turkheim actually it was a working camp, and it had very few people from Poland. The majority of the people there were from Greece, from Salonika, from various, I suppose, Turkey and Greece, and then our shipment from Poland. And we were in Turkheim for a long time. And from Turkheim, we were told, that's when we were told for sure, that if the war is over at 12 o'clock, not to worry, that we'll never make it anyway. But we knew that the war was coming to an end. Somehow somebody heard a radio, and the radio that Roosevelt was involved in it, and that the Americans have entered the war. And it was definitely established that we were moved from camp to camp because it was the end of the war. And so I remember in Turkheim a tremendous amount of commotion. I was with Sala and Frida then, so I had already like an extended family. a tremendous commotion. People were running frantically, SS was running frantically, doors were opened in various places which were closed before. And all of a sudden, we were told that we are going to Dachau. And they marched us, they lined us up, and we were going to walk to Dachau. And we were lined up 4 or 5 in a row, and we had, on both sides, we had SS with guns pointing at us. And as we were marching, of course, if you fell down, they shot you. This was normal procedure, as soon as you stumbled. And as we were marching to Dachau, we saw planes over our heads. Literally, so close, as you see them when they come into the airport. And when we saw the planes and we saw bombs, the SS started running all over, and several of us ran, and I was among a group of people that we started just running, and we ran into the woods. And the first night we ran into the woods, we had no idea where we were, no earthly idea. The first night in the woods we huddled, and we had shots. Or when we got into the woods, there were some Russians too from concentration camp. We thought we were the only ones from Poland. We found out that people from Russia were also in camps. We huddled very closely, and all night long bullets were coming into those woods. We were scared to death that this is the end of us. All night we were up with bullets. Bullets were coming next to this Russian fellow. They came practically within an inch of his head. And we were lying on the floor. And we were there for a few days until we knew that there was nothing to eat for us. We had no food, and I remember the woods were filled with, water, from the leaves and sap moisture, so we drank the moisture from the leaves and kept ourselves on that. And then one of our a couple of people, when the shooting stopped after the 3rd day, looked outside through these thick trees, and they looked and they walked to the road a little bit, and on the road they saw wagon after wagon, German wagons. We didn't know they were German, but they saw wagons turned over on the road and horses dead. So we walked out and we peered, and we saw that the people, that there were in fact German wagons that had supplies on them, and that the horses were dead and the people in the wagons were dead. So we picked what we could and we started walking. And we walked and we walked. There was not a soul on the road. It was dead silence. And we walked until we got to a house. And we got into a house and we knocked on the door, and it was a German family. And most of us spoke German because we picked it up in concentration camp. That was the only official language. And they opened the door for us and they let us in. And they were very hospitable. They put us to bed, and they fed us. And this was the first time in 5 years that we had a meal and that we slept in a bed. Everybody got very sick the next day, very, very sick. We thought we were going to die from cramps and vomiting because we were not used to meals. And then they told us that the Americans have come and that we are liberated. We had our concentration camp garb on, with a white... and that we are in a little town called Turkheim, and that we are in Bavaria, and that we are very close to, Landsberg, which was 20 kilometers from there. So we were there, I don't remember, but we were 2 days with a German family, but we walked into the city. And we saw all the American soldiers, and everybody from all the camps, and it was just people moved into German households, and they took over the households right away. And of course Sala and Frida were there, and they had an apartment already, because I was not with them in the woods together, but we were all in the same. And we lived, lots of us. We sort of got a room. It was like an army barrack that was used during the war, and we stayed there. We didn't know what was going to happen to us. I had no family. People were registering right away. People were looking for other survivors. It was...
what were your feelings then, Hanka, as you were...
I felt very much alone through all of it, terribly alone, because I somehow was not fish nor fowl. I can't explain this feeling. I never made any I had no one my age ever to be close to. There was an enormous difference age-wise between I was not quite 15 at the time, between 14 and a half, I guess, and 19 or 20. Tremendous. A lot of lives went, and everyone seemed to have someone. And of course, right after the war, everybody had a boyfriend. I mean, this was because people were trying to reestablish families and to get someone close. And I didn't feel that I belonged anywhere. A total feeling of being all alone in the world and just not belonging anywhere. And I just, other than the fact that, again, these visions that I will find my parents, it was such a crazy thing that my parents are alive, that somehow, somewhere, or that I will be reunited with some members of my family.
Those first nights when you went to sleep, can you think of what you thought about after the war?
You mean when I was with the German household?
Yeah.
Well, I think our first thoughts were that now that the war is over, look how wonderful they are. We had a tremendous amount of hatred for those people we felt we were betrayed by. And I think I think a feeling of disbelief, a tremendous feeling of disbelief that finally that we have survived. It was a feeling of elation and a feeling of total disbelief.
And then you felt empty
Totally,
on top of that.
Yeah. And I felt very much alone.
When did the reality begin to set in?
Well, actually what happened in my case, what happened was, it was soon after the war, when I was still in Turkheim, before I had a chance to even go and see if there was a member of my family that's alive, an epidemic broke out of people who had typhoid, and I was a victim of that. And I guess what happened was that we became delirious and started running a high fever. They picked us up from the street, so to speak. Somebody must have reported, and the next thing I knew is that I was taken. They would pick us up in wagons, literally, and brought us to a place called Bad Bergen-Belsen, which was a hospital 7 kilometers or 15 kilometers from Turkheim. And when I got to that hospital, the hospital was filled. That was right after the war, a few days after. The hospital was filled and there were no more beds, so they put us in the morgue room. Now, I have to tell you, this was a few days after the war. There were no doctors, except DP doctors who went through concentration camp. And there was no Red Cross medication available yet. So they took us, we stayed in the morgue, and then they vacated across the street. There was a cloister for nuns. So they turned this cloister into a gorgeous cloister with beautiful grounds. They turned it into a hospital. And then they took all the bodies that couldn't find a place, and they put them into this cloister. And I was one of those that ended up in that cloister. And you had to, without drugs, you had to survive the crisis. I think it was 13 days, if I recall. And if you made it, you survived. And if not, but people became insane during that period of time and didn't make it. Your hair fell out, and I remember, somehow later, I don't remember, just that a lot of people just never made it. They went crazy. They lost their mind because of the high fever. Anyhow, I made it. And actually what happened during that time, I made it, and Sala and Frida found that I was sick. And I was in the hospital for a long time, several months. And during that period, they had befriended American soldiers and were able to get oranges from them and eggs and whatever supplies they could. And every single day, they walked to that hospital to bring me these things to nourish me back to health. And during that period of time, Frida found her husband, and Sala found her fiancé. And they were in Stuttgart, or they found them, because there was no communication. People just walked and walked and walked through Rubel, looking, and DP camps, but displaced persons camps were set up, and everybody went. And I remember distinctly not feeling a part of any of it. It was such a crazy, I was like always very much alone. And when the men found out where they were, or they, however way, they came to Turkheim. And Salah and Frida refused to leave without me, because they insisted that wherever they go, I am going with them. And, I think they really wanted me to spend the rest of my life with them. They sort of wanted to adopt me. And the doctor said that under any circumstances, they waited and waited for me. And after I finished with typhoid, or typhus, I don't remember which, it's in my records. I don't remember which was first. Anyway, I got the second one soon after. And the second one was very bad. I broke out in these brown spots. But by that time, the Red Cross started sending medication already. And I remember hallucinating. I was telling you, I hallucinated so vividly that when they would bring the blankets, and by that time everyone had gotten well or died. So there I was, the only one that was left with this disease the second time around. And I remember seeing my entire war experiences in the minutest detail. Everything. And I kept saying, I wish I could, I've got to write this down, I've got to write this down. My mind thinking, I've got to write this down, because I saw the colors, I could smell, I could see where we were hiding. All these places in Poland which I have forgotten by now, because I'm just giving you the highlights. I mean, there are volumes of things that I have forgotten. When my father was taken, what happened in the days, what happened before that, all of this, the beginning of the war. Anyway, I came down. After the typhoid, I had a secondary. I was left with a complication, and they didn't know what it was. And I was very, very sick, and it got to a point where the doctors they stopped coming to my room. I mean, I was literally left to die. What it turned out afterwards was when it was diagnosed after a long, long time, I was left with an inflammation of the cardiac sac from it. What is it? Pericarditis? I don't know. Is that pericarditis? Mm-hmm. But and thank God I'm all right. I mean, I don't have any. There was a murmur once upon a time, and I'm fine. But that was the complication that I was left with, and it took so long that the doctor said, under any circumstances, can I go on a trip to Stuttgart? That I will just die on the way. That they took off for Stuttgart, Salah, Frida, and the men, and they promised me and had an agreement with the doctor that when he feels I'm ready to go to Stuttgart, that he would let them know. They were constantly in touch, and they would come back for me. And I was in that hospital. It seemed months, I don't know how long I was there. And finally, when the doctor felt that I can travel, he in fact contacted them. And they came and got me and took me to Stuttgart. And when I got to Stuttgart, I felt lonelier than ever. The war was over by that time for a number of months. Everyone had someone. If you didn't find your family, you had a boyfriend. Salah and David, both sisters, lived together in an apartment building that I got in Stuttgart. And they were like two couples, and everyone they knew already had someone. So they were like only couples, and there I was. And, everybody was gay, and they went every night out, and they were doing black market stuff. And I was a child, really, who knew nothing about life, felt terribly lonely, did not have one living soul, and didn't fit into this way of life at all. I felt I was a total misfit.
You were 15?
I was 15, not quite, yeah. And I didn't seem to belong in this world, and I didn't have anyone to belong. It was awful. I remember going, terrible. And I wanted desperately to go to Israel. This I knew. So someone was telling me, David came back and he said, was I aware? They knew. That there was a place, and I didn't know any of the jokes, and I didn't have a sense of humor that everybody had, and I didn't know anything about life. I mean, I was backwards and behind. My education was my 3 years of school before the war. So he said that the United Nations was establishing camps for orphans, children who, had no one at all in this world. and that there was one outside of Heidelberg. You had to have a sponsor. And this idea appealed to me a lot. And so I asked him to investigate it, and he sponsored me. You had to have someone to bring you to sign for you. Excuse me. So I ended up in a place called the Glasterhausen, which was a United Nations. It was sponsored by the United Nations Rehabilitation Relief Committee. It was a place where before the war, I understand, they had mentally retarded German children. It was like the closest thing to a boarding house. The ladies from the United Nations were angels from God. I mean, never have I met more wonderful people. There were kids there from all over Europe. There were Jewish children, Estonian children, Lithuanian children, Romanian children, anyone, any religion. They started since they were 3 years old, from 3 up. What they did, in fact, is they tried to make us live like one family. They tried to make up to us, to do away with our hate and to do away with our hostility and somehow rehabilitate us into a normal life. They gave us some lessons, English lessons. There was a school for us. We had volleyball games. We had an orchestra on Friday night for square dancing and songs, and we ate at one family-style dining room tables, and it was a very happy period of our time.
How were you responding? Were you happy with this?
I beg your pardon?
Were you happy?
I was very happy, except for one thing, that a lot of the kids there had family. They didn't have an immediate family in Germany, but they had family in other parts, like my sister-in-law had family in, my now sister-in-law had family in Detroit. She was an orphan after the war, but she had aunts and uncles. I had no one. In that sense, but it was a very happy time in the sense that I didn't have to make any decisions, and I was being taken care of, and I was out of the environment which I was very unhappy in, which was Stuttgart. And then they put a decision to us. They asked us where we would like to go. They were to live, and. Excuse me, I right away said, they prepared us, they gave us background material of the United States, gave us lessons, told us what to expect in this country. I vividly remember listening, and we had a translator. Excuse me. They told us, for instance, about Frank Sinatra, and what an idol, when they told us about the United States. And I decided Israel was my place.
That
did not come.
That did not work out. You came to the United States instead. What, as you reflect back on those early experiences, what do you make of it today? How do you put it into context of your life today?
When you say
those early experiences, not when all of these horrible things were happening to you.
You mean
as far as those things today?
You mean as far as the Nazi era? I think part of it, I don't know whether it's my childhood or the Nazi era, I think I have I have a tremendous compassion for other people who are suffering, and I don't know whether it's because of concentration camp or whether it's because of my upbringing. And I have a tremendous will to survive. In other words, I feel that it's a commitment that I have to pass my legacy on and to leave the world, at least try to contribute in some small measure that this never, ever, ever happens again. And I also am left with an enormous amount of guilt, which has been a burden in my life. Is that what you mean as far as reflecting? I don't go around, I don't have the hate that I used to have. I've mellowed with age. I would find it very difficult. I would not go into Germany because the memories, although I have been there and I've passed through it, I've never been able to stay. On the other hand, I've had contact with German people, and I've had a next-door neighbor, and it was almost like a test in San Francisco who was German for a while, and I was able to associate. I don't know. I have not been able to come to terms of how. I don't know. I feel part of my life has been, I've tried to use it in a constructive way, the experiences, because I feel it can be a destructive experience, and I feel that it has left me, after having survived this, that my life should be it should be a constructive one, if it's to have any meaning at all.
Sounds like a good place to stop.